Thank you everybody for joining together with me at Beit Avichai. I know that some of you are regulars and that there are a number of you who are new to Beit Avichai. As we know, Beit Avichai is a hub for original Jewish Israeli culture. And as part of their raison d'etre, about 10 years ago, the team here at Beit Avichai began to explore ways that they could link to the Jewish calendar, Luach HaShanah. The team were thinking specifically about Yom HaZikaron and whether there could be new ways to commemorate Israel's fallen soldiers and victims of terror. And so they began this project creating animated movies. The goal today is to share a sample of the project to explain the context and the contribution of this project to Israeli society. Before we actually look at Yom HaZikaron and how we remember the fallen, I want to actually begin by jumping right in and watching our first animated movie. This movie, called Mayim Shketim, or Silent Waters, is about Keren Tendler. Keren was a flight mechanic in the Air Force, and she tragically was killed at age 26 during the Second Lebanon War in 2006. The movie is just over 3 minutes long. If we could please watch Mayim Shketim. Thank you. I hope you'll agree that that was a very, very powerful movie. We'll return a little bit later to Karen's story. The Beit Avichai project of A Face of Memory a Day wanted to find a different way to commemorate Israel's fallen soldiers and victims of terror. And in order to appreciate how the project decided to mark and commemorate things differently, first we're going to explore this evening Yom HaZikaron in Israel and how Israeli society remembers its fallen. So, a lot of us are probably familiar with the placement in the calendar of Yom HaZikaron immediately prior to Yom HaAtzmaut. There is a symbolism there right from the very beginnings of the State of Israel that in order to appreciate what we have, we need to understand where it came from and at what cost we received the benefit of a state. Already by 1951, the first tekasim, ceremonies, began to take place around the country. And today you may well be familiar with the evening tekas that takes place at the Kotel, at the Wailing Wall, in the presence of the President of the State and the Chief of Staff. The morning of Yom HaZikaron, we have the official state ceremony taking place on Har Herzl, where generally the Prime Minister will speak. And there are ceremonies that are taking place all the way around the country, from kindergartens and schools, youth movements, community centers, and every single municipality around the country. Many of us probably familiar with the infamous siren that takes place twice over Yom HaZikaron, for 1 minute in the evening at 8 p.m., for 2 minutes on the morning of Yom HaZikaron at 11 a.m., and we've probably all either experienced this ourselves or seen footage of people getting out their cars, standing to attention and waiting in silence. On Yom HaZikaron, the flags are placed at half-mast. All of the stores and the restaurants close. And the day really centers on commemorating Israel's fallen. The shift of focus of Israeli society moves to the cemeteries, where bereaved families are joined by friends, army comrades, and members of the public who flock en masse to the various state cemeteries and army cemeteries around the country. The graves are all cleaned specially. Flags, small flags, are placed together with candles by every single grave. And there's a real atmosphere of togetherness as people come to hear the stories of the fallen, offer their support and comfort. And you can see here this picture of the famous sticker that many people wear on Yom HaZikaron at the cemeteries or just around the country of the Dam HaMakkabim flower as the official memorial flower of Yom HaZikaron. On Yom HaZikaron, the radio, the television and the internet, all of the broadcasts are interrupted and the day is dominated by themes of Yom HaZikaron. Many of you will be familiar that there is almost a playlist of songs and music for Yom HaZikaron, sad songs, war songs, songs that have been put together from the lyrics of soldiers or victims of terror who have fallen. There are even newer traditions, as we can see here, of public singing over the last 20 years, the most famous of them being in Kikar Rabin in Tel Aviv and also in Kikar Safra in Jerusalem. The TV channels screen over the course of the day and a little bit extended over the course of the day the names of every single fallen soldier, over 24,000 soldiers who are commemorated on screen. And the television also features special programs including stories of the fallen, battles and military events, and most importantly, interviews with the bereaved families themselves. Moving away from Yom HaZikaron and the day itself, I'd like to just talk for a little while about memorials in general through the country. Many of you who either live here in Israel or have visited here would be familiar with some of the famous andartaot, or memorials that are placed all around the country. These memorials commemorate great battles, tragic events, and moments of important historical significance. Here on this slide, we can see 4 such andartaot, 4 such memorials. In the top left, we see the famous lion representing the Battle of Tel Chai in 1920 and the falling of Yosef Trumpeldor. On the top right, we see the Shar Yashuv Memorial up in the north, marking the 1997 tragedy, Israel's greatest military accident leading to the death of 73 soldiers when two combat helicopters crashed into each other. On the bottom left, we can see the Negev Brigade Memorial in Beersheba, representing the contributions and the deaths of over 300 Palmach combatants during the 1948 War of Independence. And in the bottom right, anyone that's traveled between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem on Kvish Echad on Road 1 will be familiar with these supply convoys trying to break the siege to Jerusalem in 1948, and those are commemorated here. Some of these memorials are produced and created by Israel's greatest artists and architects. Some of them have been funded by family and friends, but they are all jointly meant to inspire people with the stories and to commemorate significant events. But across Israel, there are even smaller memorials that we may see, sometimes only even a plaque. These are two images from my city, Jerusalem, on the left-hand side representing the Battle of San Simon from my local park and a famous and significant military victory in 1948's War of Independence. And on the right-hand side, marking the Cafe Hillel, cafe that used to exist on Emek Rephaim in downtown Jerusalem, and a bombing in 2003 that led to the deaths of 7 people, including famously David and Naama Applebaum, who are commemorated in one of the movies in this project. These memorials are all weighty, they are heavy, they are difficult, and they all represent things that we are supposed to remember and that we are surrounded by. But even the language that we use on Yom HaZikaron to talk about the fallen is something that we can pay attention to. We color the language that we use on Yom HaZikaron with very emotional words. Sadness dominates, and we talk a lot as a society about death. We also have various narratives and ways that society frames the significance of Yom HaZikaron, be that the battles, the military events, the terror attacks. We talk about sacrifice and heroism, and we express our gratitude and indebtedness to those that allowed us to live today thanks to their lives. And if we pay attention to the speeches that are mentioned on the day across the country, whether on television or in ceremonies or in schools, and the atmosphere in general, there are numerous motifs that appear time and time again. Those motifs of unity and togetherness. We talk about ourselves as one nation and one family. So when Beit Avichai began thinking about how to do Yom HaZikaron differently, they wanted to move away from the collective aspects of the day and to give space to a much more personal approach to commemorating. And they did this in 2 different ways. One of them was to focus more on life than death itself, to spend less time talking about how an individual died and more on how they lived, often concentrating on a key moment or a memory of that individual. But Beit Avichai and this project also gave voice to different people connected with the fallen. Not only were we to hear the voices of the army and the government and officials, but we were to hear voices of parents and children, siblings, friends, even boyfriends and girlfriends, and at times, strangers who had only met the fallen just one time. Finally, I want to talk about the rationale and the reasoning for animation. There was a choice to use animation and different artists for all sorts of different reasons. The artist and the artistic nature of this project would allow us to evoke different feelings, emotions and responses differently from perhaps an interview or a biography. These movies are all short and they pack a lot in. They're very vibrant and dynamic with uses of color and music that creates and generates very, very interesting responses. And the symbolic nature of animation allows us to relay content that is sometimes even subtle or hidden. Finally, I'll share that it's very, very accessible. It invites people into a conversation and allows people to relate to the subject matter, perhaps in a different way from if this was an actual person talking or a memory of an individual commemoration that was live. So far to this day, the 45 films have been created by the Face Memory A Day project. I want to just show you the website itself so you can check this. Here you can actually see all of these films. They are available in English. You can click on each and every single movie. They're all very, very different styles, and they all contain different stories of individual or individuals. You can read more information. There are interviews. There's additional information that's there available. And also, as you can see, as I scroll at the top of the page, there is also a whole section that includes an educational component involving educational activities translated into Hebrew, English, Spanish, and even Portuguese. I'd like now to return to the story of Karen Tendler. We watched the short movie at the beginning, and right now what I'd like to do is hear the voice of Karen's friend Naama. And I'd like to watch a few minutes of an interview.
הפעם הראשונה שאני וקרן נפגשנו הייתה בבריכה. אני הייתי שחיינית צעירה בקבוצה של חבר'ה מבוגרים, הייתי בת 14, כולם שם היו בני 25 פלוס. אני עוד הייתי ב-state of mind כזה שמי שמבוגר ממני זה לא אותה שפה, וקרן הייתה שונה. קרן איכשהו דיברה את השפה שלי, והיה לי נורא קל להתחבר אליה. תמיד אני והיא היינו זוג, וכל מיני תרגילים, לדוגמה, שצריך לשחות בשרשרת, שהבן אדם האחורי מחזיק את הכפות רגליים של הקדמי, הקדמי שוחה עם הידיים, האחורי שוחה עם הרגליים. אז היא הייתה אוחזת לי בכפות רגליים, היינו יוצאים תחרות, ככה אני ברבק כל הכוח שוחה עם הידיים, ופתאום אני קולטת שהיא מדגדגת אותי בכפות רגליים, אני ככה נחנקת בכל המים, בולעת מים, לא מסיימים בכלל את הבריכה. אבל היא מתגלגלת מצחוק, היא אומרת לי, את לא יכולת לצפות שאני לא אעשה את זה. יום אחד היא באה במלתחות, כזה אני מתלבשת, ואז היא אומרת, עברתי מעל הבית שלכם, אמנם עשיתי לך שלום, ראית אותי? אמרתי לה, מה? מה זה מעל הבית שלי? אז היא אומרת, כן, מהמסוק, עברתי בדיוק מעל הבית שלך, עשיתי לך שלום. ואז ככה, לא הכרתי את זה אז על אותו רגע, אבל היא סיפרה לי מה היא עושה בצבא, שהיא מכונאית מוטסת במסוקי אסור, וכשגיליתי שהיא המכונאית המוטסת הראשונה בחיל אוויר, וכמה הייתה צריכה להילחם כדי להיכנס לקורס הזה ולסיים אותו, וכולם הסתכלו עליה ככה בחצי מבט מוזר כזה, וזה פשוט הסתדר לי, כי כל דבר שהיא הייתה עושה, שהיא רצתה להצליח בו, היא פשוט הייתה מסתערת עליו, וימות העולם, לא משנה מה, היא עושה אותו. קרן הייתה כמו אחות גדולה בשבילי. היא גרמה לי תמיד לצחוק על דברים. גם על דברים קשים ועל דברים מתסכלים. היא ידעה איך להשחיל את הבדיחונת הזאת, שתגרום לך לחייך ולחשוב וואלה.
So the tone as we listen to Naama, Karen's friend, in that interview is so sad. But the interview allows us to anchor in the reality and pain of loss by Karen's death. We can understand through listening to Naama's words the place of friends in the circle of bereavement, and we can understand swimming teammates and how they can take their place, not ordinarily two groups of people who would be part of the inner circle of the bereaved. If we think back to the movie that we saw right at the beginning, we can now understand perhaps some of the artistic decisions of the animators, that swimming wasn't just a random choice, but was actually based on Karen's life and her hobby and passion. We can focus on the music and the lightness of how the music allows us to enter almost into realms of fantasy. You may remember that the film showed us how Karen and her friend Naama floated up into the air and the helicopter came down into the sea, two almost impossible things to happen. we kind of are alluded to through the animation in stories and messages about Karen, about her boundary breaking, how she swam against the current and against the tide in her desire to be a female pilot. We can pay attention to how helpful and kind she was to her friend, and the way how she dived into the pool with no one actually asking her to, indicating in some ways her determination. I find this movie offers us a warm and dignified way to commemorate Karen. We're going to move on to another movie in a minute. This movie is called Ksharim, or Connections, and it commemorates Mira Ben Ari. Mira was born in Berlin in Germany. She moved to Tel Aviv in the 1930s, and she was part of the Zionist pioneering spirit. She joined a youth movement. She eventually joined a kibbutz called Nitzanim, where she met Eliakim, who she married, and by age 19, she had already given birth to her child, Danny. War broke out in 1948, and the kibbutz came regularly under fire by the Egyptians. All of the children of the kibbutz were evacuated to a nearby settlement. Mira herself was a radio operator, and she chose to stay back and not leave the kibbutz with her child Danny. She was killed after the kibbutz was captured by the Egyptian army. She was aged 22. We're going to watch the movie now. What an incredibly moving tribute to Mira Ben Ari. All of these films themselves demand repeat viewing. The more that you watch, the more you'll notice the different themes and the genius of the animators to weave in so much content and so many ideas and so many values. So I'll share with you a few of my thoughts as I watched that film. And what we really notice is how the film opens with Mira as the mother, playing at home, holding up her child Danny into the air, giggling and having fun. And then we switch into the planes flying overhead. The movie in its few minutes switches continuously between the domestic aspects of Mira's life as a mum to Danny and her maternal behaviors, and switches often to the national context and the military story which is going on. A few other examples of that would be how at one moment she's tuning in the radio to communicate with the illegal immigration vessels, and then in the next scene it switches to her changing the clothes of her little toddler. Later we see her playing outside whilst Danny flies a paper aeroplane, and then we switch to see the sandbags and the windows being closed and the winds of war approaching. Mira ties the waves together in this film, and the animators show and indicate to us her involvement in how she guided the illegal immigrant vessels in the 1940s from the Mediterranean to the coastline. And the movie ends with her tying her son's shoelaces before she looks out the window watching a toddler walk away and bursting into tears. There's almost a symbolism there of her tying the knot of the shoelaces, tying knots indicating the bringing together and the binding together of two separate entities into one thing. Sometimes we hope that the knots will last forever in some ways, but often a shoelace will become untied. And so the relationship between Danny and Mira was severed when she was killed. What's particularly interesting about this movie is how what it does is it removes the historical and social context of Mira Ben Ari and what was going on at the time and zooms into her as a mother. We do not focus significantly on the battle, on Egypt, on 1948, on the War of Independence. We also don't focus on the story of surrender of the kibbutz of Nitzanim to the Egyptians, which became a very dramatic and controversial story here within Israel for many, many decades. The movie also doesn't concentrate on these heroic aspects of Mira Ben Ari. There was recently an Israeli movie that was made by Avi Nesher, which really portrays Mira in this heroic light. Instead, the animators zoom in on Mira Ben Ari as a mother, and they frame her motherhood within a collective story of the nation as a whole. The next story that I'd like to talk about, and the next movie that I'd like to watch, is called Meitarim, or Strings. This tells the story of Yaron Blum, a soldier that was killed in 1995 at the age of 20. He was killed in a suicide bombing at Beit Lid, together with 21 other soldiers and one civilian. The movie that we're about to watch focuses on a single event. It zooms in on a musical jam session between Yaron and two friends. Here we are, Meitarim.
אם היו לי איתו חיים שלמים, הייתי יכול לבחור ממאגר הזיכרונות. אבל יש לי רק זיכרון של אחר צהריים אחד, חיוך ולחיצת יד. וחדר אחד שבו המוזיקה קרתה. רגע פשוט ושברירי. חוזרים הביתה. אני חושב על זה שיכולנו עוד לדבר במקום לשתוק. להגיד עוד משהו. הייתי רוצה לשאול אותו על מה הוא חושב. לדעת מי הוא. אולי פשוט לשאול אותו איך הייתה לו החזרה. ויצא לי לנגן איתו רק פעם אחת.
a very different movie from the previous two. And I hope by showcasing 4 movies this evening that you will really understand the variety of animation styles, the different types of stories which are told, and the different people who are commemorating those stories. Here in the movie that we just watched about Yaron, it is almost as if the film Meitarim ignores Yaron's biography. We don't know about him being born in 1974 in Jerusalem as the oldest of 3 siblings. We don't know about how much he loved computers and science fiction and how he served in a combat service support role in the armory unit and how he hoped to study in the Hebrew University. The focus instead is on this one specific moment, this musical rehearsal, this music session with these 2 friends, Eitan and Dudu. What's so interesting about the choice of the animators and the story of Yaron Bloom that we were exposed to here is that this was really a chance meeting. Eitan was not a particularly close friend of Yaron, and Dudu met Yaron only the one time. This movie really doesn't have that much to do with the terror attack or Yaron as a soldier. It's about 3 friends having a moment together, jamming musically together. We see the way that they prepare and do their warm-up and the deep connections of all of the musicians together, how they tune their instruments and how they synchronize themselves together. There's also a very, very strong motif of birds throughout the film. These birds in some ways represent many, many different things. For me, they represent the idea of freedom. They represent the joy of movement, of flight. The movie has got so many instances through its music and its focus on the forest of beauty and tranquility and almost harmony. The birds seem to be repeating messages of connection and what gets left behind as they pass beyond and through the different people who are presented. And how some birds get to stay on the wires at the end whilst other birds fly off into the air. And how the animators chose to portray the musical chords together with the flights of the birds is so moving and so clever. These deep connections and the motifs of the music really come to portray how loss and bereavement ripples throughout society, and that so much bereavement is actually hidden from view. We don't hear the voices of the parents or the siblings. We don't hear the voices of the army commanders or the other people that were caught up in this horrific terror incident. We just have these few small moments, this encounter. And it makes us think about the people that we can meet along the course of our lives, the people that pass through our lives. Every single person has a story to tell. And if you paid attention to the end voice of one of Yaron's friends, because the movie is so short, we are really left with this impression and the words of the friends who says that I like to think of what could have been had Yaron gone on to live. And we don't know the story that would have been. And so we feel Yaron's loss even further of the friendship, of the stories, of future musical experiences that this trio could have had together. I'd like to focus now on our final movie of this evening. And this movie, called Gail, tells the story of Gail Rubin. Gail was an American who was born and raised in Manhattan, New York. In the 1960s, she made Aliyah after a number of visits here to Israel. She was a photographer, primarily a war photographer, before she made Aliyah. And because she came in 1969, by the time she'd already lived in Israel for a number of years, 1973, the Yom Kippur War or the October War, she actually went into the Sinai with combatants and took and documented photographs of the soldiers during the war itself. After the war, though, she transitioned and changed and became a nature photographer. She had exhibitions and published a few albums. And her photographs moved away from the horrors of war and began to take in nature, wildlife, and landscapes. In 1978, while she was strolling along the beach of Ma'agan Michael Kibbutz, she was shot by terrorists who were on the way to carry out an infamous atrocity known as the Coastal Road Massacre, where 39 people were killed in terrible circumstances. Most people are not actually aware of the story of Gail because she was the first victim in this terror incident. We're going to watch the movie in a few moments. The movie has the poem by Israel's famous poet Natan Yonatan, which is read out by an Israeli actor by the name of Ayelet Zura. And it tells the story of the rotem flower, or the retama flower in English, sometimes translated as the white broom. It's a very, very beautiful and moving imagery in this film, and we're going to watch it now. Thank you.
והרותם היה מלבין, והולך לי איתו לאורך הדרך. תל אביב עטופה ערפל, ירושלים רחוקה. מישהו אולי לא יגיע לסוף החורף הזה, לשום מקום. דם הולך ודם בא, והארץ לעולם עומדת. אתמול נורתה בליבה צלמת אחת יפת תואר, שחמדה זהב דיונות ופריחה אצילה של סכנאים, לשמוע את הטבע של מעגן מיכאל. איך שהיא מבריחה במעופה עננים, ומפזרת להקת עמודי חשמל במסעה אל סעודת הקודש החורפית בבריכת הדגים הרדומה. לא לכך נתכוונתי מלכתחילה. טיוטה זו נרשמה בראשית החורף. ניצנים ראשונים של כפור נקעו באוויר. הירוק הימי של הרותם התנשב גלים גלים ברוח החופית. רציתי להשאיר אחריי בצוק העיתים וידוי קצר על אהבת רותם ועל הצורך בכתיבת שירים. חשבתי שיופי יוכל להגן עלינו ועל הילדים מאש ומקרח. שאותה כסיפה עדינה של פרח לאורך הדרך, והארץ האחת שנשארה, ורותם חולות מדברי ויופיו הנורא. חשבתי.
Very, very moving movie. And at the end, we actually saw some of Gail's actual photographs that she took herself. There's a lot of imagery of nature inside this movie that we just saw, be it of the kingfisher or the storks and herons, the frogs, the clouds, the beach. We can pay attention to the different coloring of the movie and how it shifts from the darkness of war and to the lightness of nature. We can focus on the actual text of the poem itself by Natan Yonatan and the temporary nature and the elusive nature of the beauty of the natural world and the hope and desire that somehow that natural beauty would protect us from the violence and terror that can sometimes surround us. The movie is very, very powerful because it allows us to remember Gail's story herself within a broader telling of the story of a terror attack. It connects us to her passion for photography, her life, and her connection to nature, We can understand here is an American woman who made Aliyah and made a transition from war movies to nature photography, and then ends up being a victim of terror herself. It lets us remember her as a photographer, and it juxtaposes the horror of death itself with the beauty that actually inspired her life. Very, very moving movie itself. So as I begin to wrap up, we've seen now 4 separate movies over the course of this evening, and I began by wanting to present a sample of the Beit Avichai project. That if you remember, I said that there are over 40 different movies, 45 different movies that we now have hosted on the website. From year to year, we continue to add more, as well as educational programs, interviews, and more background information, footage and photographs that you can all see on the website. And we wanted to understand these movies in their context and their contribution to Israeli society itself. So we've seen 4 different stories among the 45 from this project of A Face, a Memory, a Day, representing just 4 stories among the tens of thousands of people that have lost their lives, given their lives either as soldiers or who've fallen as victims of terror. We've connected in the 4 films that we've seen with soldiers, with males, with females, with native Israeli-born Sabras to immigrants and Olim Chadashim. We've seen victims of terror, whether that be civilian victims of terror or soldiers caught up in terror attacks. We've also seen different styles of animation, some of them being more light and playful, some of them being more heavy and serious, some of them perhaps moved you more than others. And that's the beauty of this project itself. Panim Yom HaZikaron, A Face, a Memory, a Day, that allows us to really connect in so many different ways with so many different stories. We've also heard different voices that have been narrated here through the movies themselves, not just of the close circle of bereavement, but we've heard friends, we've heard people that had no voice, we've heard letters that were left behind, we've had parents, we've had strangers, and when you watch these different movies, you will really get to hear so many different voices of people. So if we think about the films that we've seen, and going back, we began with Karen Tendler and noticing how Karen's story of her as an air pilot, Maim Shketim, and how we gave a different voice and we brought those stories of animation and lightness and fantasy almost to present the project. And we then framed Naama and her interview, and how actually we get anchored with the story of a friend telling about the tragic loss, and how the animators worked through their creative means to tell the story of Karen, not just in her death, but Karen in her life. We then moved over to the story of Mira Ben Ari and the knots and the connections that she tied, both as a radio operator during the Independence War, but also the connections to her son Danny and what she left behind, and how that story focused less on the specifics of the battle and heroism or surrender of the kibbutz itself, and focused on the dichotomy between the national story and the personal story of Mira as a mother. We then moved across to the story of Meitarim, of strings, where we had a chance encounter between Dudu and Eitan with the soldier Yaron Bloom the day before he was tragically killed in a terror accident, and how actually sometimes deep connections and relationships can be formed in just a single moment, making us think not just of the national story, but the hidden story of bereavement across the country by all those people who were lesser connected and not quite in the direct inner circle of bereavement. And then we finish with the story of Gail, a victim of terror that came from New York, and tried to present the combination of the beauty of nature with the tragedy of terror, and tell a story of terrorism and a single individual and her hobby and passion that isn't always told. So that is all from me in terms of presenting the Panim Yom HaZikaron, the Face a Memory a Day project. I hope that you will all feel welcome to check out the website and take in more of the movies and understand more about what this project is about, and that you've received a taster of this project, but also understood a little bit more about the history, the context of what this project tried to do, trying to find a new voice, a new way to commemorate Israel's fallen. I'm going to pass over to Tamar now.
Thank you very much, Marc, for sharing these meaningful movies and stories with us. And I'm responding to a few questions about people who would like to pass on this talk and information to other people. You'll all receive the link by email to your email accounts. And thank you very much for joining you. And I hope you take these moments on with you, and they'll help us mark the next few days. And thank you from Beit Avichai. Good evening.